Eitan, welcome. Eitan is a creative director, copywriter, brand builder, and the founder of the Nati branding agency in Tel Aviv. He's been delivering branding campaigns for B2C and B2B clients for over 25 years, having lived in Hong Kong, London, Tel Aviv, New York, and Boston, working with big names such as Google, Volkswagen, American Express, and Toyota, as well as Israeli companies like Amdocs, the Jewish Agency for Israel, and Taglit. In 2015, Eitan created a video that went viral called I'm That Jew, and it's been viewed more than 15 million times on various platforms. He also gave a popular TED Talk to explain the motivation behind this clip. Eitan has consistently been an advocate for Israel and the Jewish people, gaining a following on social media, but since October 7th, he's dedicated all of his time to fighting Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, focusing on building Jewish pride. Eitan, welcome. The mic's all yours. Eitan, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you have consulted with the who's who. You have done campaigns for all the big names, but I think your name was launched into the spotlight with that video clip that we just mentioned. I'm That Jew. 15 million views.
Something like that, yeah.
Now, I have so many questions about that, but let's suffice with the following.
Sure.
For those of us who haven't seen it, and yes, I will give you the link to that in the bio. However, can you just give us a brief synopsis, 30 seconds of what it's about? And then what was your heart in making it? And why did it touch so many hearts?
Sure. After Charlie Hebdo, if you remember the massacre in Charlie Hebdo, there were a couple of Jewish people that were killed in a kosher supermarket. A friend of mine who was living in France at the time, who's Jewish and lived in Israel, I called her to check in on her. And she was terrified, and she wasn't telling anyone that she was Jewish. And I thought to myself, this is in 2014, 2015. How can, in this day and age, someone be afraid to say that they're Jewish? And so I sat down and I wrote, I'm That Jew, and I just sat down and it just came out. And what I was feeling solidarity with her. A lot of people that see the piece think that I'm speaking about anti-Semitism, and it's a statement about anti-Semitism, but actually what it is, it's a statement of solidarity for my Jewish brothers and sisters around the world. Right. And I think I was able to maybe break the stereotype. When you say a Jew, you might think a land grabber, we own the banks, we own the media, all sorts of ridiculous things like that. And my statement was, no, that's not me. This is me. And I'm not one thing. I'm infinite things. And I think that spoke to a lot of people.
I want to discuss the war that we are all engaged with at the moment. And that is not a war that's happening on a battlefield on the ground. It's not a physical war. Now, for that, let's go back approximately 11 years, way back when, in 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. And that was the second conflict between Israel and Hamas, if I'm correct. Now, that is currently being known as the first social media war. Fancy word just for the IDF, Hamas, ordinary citizens taking to, then it was Facebook and Twitter only, sharing their images, sharing their videos, argumenting, sharing what this is like for them. So can you help us out a little bit with the origins of the social media war? How did it start?
I remember back in the day on Facebook when people just used to post pictures of their families and funny videos, and it was very like personal, getting to know people, staying in touch with people. And I remember during that war when all of a sudden I felt people started posting things that were very anti-Israel, and I'm an Israeli. I was born here. I grew up in Hong Kong and London. I lived in New York and Boston. And I came back to Israel around 15 years ago. And I saw what people outside of Israel were saying, including friends of mine and colleagues. And the things that some people were saying were simply not true. And I don't think that it was something intentional. I think that people started sharing things from resources that somehow had gotten to them. And I felt that it was my responsibility to counter the lie, counter the false narrative. And it was tough to do, because I'm not a famous person, I'm a dad. I've got 2 kids, and at the time, I had 1. And it was very, very disturbing for me to see people that I knew sharing things that I knew were not true. And so I started speaking up. And you started to see other people speaking up slowly. You also started to see people who were spreading things about us, whether it was intentional or not intentional. These false narratives were being amplified. And that's kind of scary, because when you have people saying things that are not true about you, and it's on a global scale, like social media, even at the time, like what's happening now is not a surprise for me, because you saw it coming a while back. And it's just grown and grown and grown. And this social media war wasn't really a war to begin with. It was just people expressing. But now it's turned into a war because there is an agenda. There's an agenda that is being fueled by, I think, parties that are interested in more war, more conflict, more anti-Semitism, more intolerance. And there are people who want to counter that with the truth. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a very, very complex thing, which I think boils down to something very, very simple, which is there are a lot of stories out there, a lot of narratives out there, and a lot of them aren't true. So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to just sit back and say, hey, it's not my problem, I'm just going to live my life? Or are you going to do something about it? And when I was growing up, I see in your library here, you have lots of books about the Second World War. My grandfather had all the books that Churchill had written. He had The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer, which is a book that thick. And it was a responsibility to read it and to understand it and to learn it. And that was my generation, like a few decades ago. Today's generation, I think the young people, they don't read, they don't learn, they don't get into things. It's very bite-sized information. And I think that that's scary. I think that that's scary because when you let that go for too long, then you get to the stage when people are just seeing something, assuming it's true, and if it's interesting and it's moving and it turns you on, you'll share it on social media. And that's what's happened. And we're in that perfect storm of kind of what's true and what isn't, anti-Semitism, intolerance, all of that together, because it's so easy to share things now, and so much of it isn't true. So I decided, at least with my stuff, is I'm going to put out what I know is true. And that doesn't mean that I'm against Palestinians, it doesn't mean that I'm against Islam, it doesn't mean any of that stuff. What I'm against is I'm against intolerance, I'm against hatred, and I'm against
people coming to slaughter you.
Yeah, but it doesn't start with people coming to slaughter you. It starts with people speaking. It starts with narrative. Words, how did Hitler come to power?
Words.
Yeah, I mean,
Man could speak.
around, I don't know how many percent of his power was Goebbels. You know, it was narrative, and I think that's where, for example, the Palestinian movement has succeeded so well is with their narrative. They've invested in narrative, and this is what I keep telling Jewish and Israeli and Jewish allies. Narrative, 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 narrative. Narrative is important. Narrative is important. You have to invest in narrative. And social media is narrative. The problem is what happens when it's false? What happens when it's sexy? What happens when, you know, dead pictures of dead babies sell? You know, I'm not saying that's sexy. It's not sexy, but
it's emotive.
It's emotive. And we're facing accumulation of decades of a narrative that just landed on us. And unfortunately, we haven't been there. You know, as a Jewish people and Israel, we haven't invested in narrative like we should have, and they have. So we're behind the curve. We're massively outnumbered. And we are also not organized in terms of the Jewish people, you know, which we're starting to mobilize now. But that's social media. It's not just something that happens. Sometimes it does, but I think here it's organized.
I do want to speak about narrative.
Sure.
But firstly, let's backtrack a step or two. I feel like social media reporting on the ground, sharing what's going on, that's great. It gives you an insider's perspective. However, possibly the one casualty in social media warfare is truth. And we've touched on this often. How does that happen? And can you give me a number of examples of the social media inaccuracies? We've all come across them. But for instance, genocide. Genocide is terrible. Am I against it? Absolutely. However, the question is it applicable to Israel? So how do inaccuracies become truths like that? Because I feel like it's true because I saw my friend say it on TikTok yesterday. So therefore, it must be true. How do we deal with that and what to do? That's a lot too.
Well, I mean, I try and tell my kids as a dad, you know, you can't believe everything you hear. You can't believe everything you see. You have to step into the shoes and of the person, of the situation on the ground. And that requires not being lazy, doing the work. If I hear that there's a genocide in some province in China, I don't automatically assume that just because someone's telling me that there's a genocide there, that there's a genocide there. And that's one of the challenges we have with the world today, that facts don't matter. And I think people have been saying that a lot, you know, facts don't matter. But what does that mean? If I show you right now a picture of dead people on the ground, and I say, look at this terrible thing that happened, and look at who did it, am I going to believe that immediately? Or am I going to look into it and try and understand context? Because the ramifications of just, look, there's no denying that dead kills people on the ground is an awful thing. So to examine facts doesn't mean that you're not empathetic to that. But what it does mean is, let's understand the context here. Where are these people? Why are they here? Did anyone stop them trying to leave here? Were they warned about not to be here? Do they believe certain things that made them stay? I'm just making things up right now, but I think that context is so important because then that allows you to get to the truth.